There are a lot of different ways to define faith, but one of my favorites comes from a man named Elton Trueblood. With a last name like that, you got to take him seriously. He was the chaplain at Harvard as well as the chaplain at Stanford, and he defined faith this way. Faith is not belief without proof. Faith is trust without reservation. And that trust aspect gets us to the core of what faith is all about. I work with a lot of people that are going through faith crisis, and honestly, I wonder if a better word for that would be testimony crisis, because so often it's things that they don't feel like they can check the box on mental acceptance. They think of faith as propositional. Can I agree with these doctrines, these propositions? But that to me is testimony meeting faith. And what we're after, especially in Scripture, is what I call hospital bed faith. The faith to move mountains, as President Nelson has recently described it. That is not propositional faith, that is relational faith. It's not a matter of the historicity of the book of Abraham. It's more a matter of, do I trust God's will for me in a hospital bed, in a trial? Do I know that God is with me? Now, if we're looking for that kind of faith, there's no better place to look than the Old Testament, especially as we turn to Abram and Sarai. Now, very soon they'll be known as Abraham and Sarah, so we might as well go with those names to begin with. But pick up in chapter 15 of Genesis. Abraham has already had this promise from God that I will bless you with posterity like the sands of the sea and the stars of heaven. And he was in the desert at night when God told him that. Talk about great visual aid setting up the classroom. I'm from LA. If God said you'll have seed like the stars of heaven, I would have looked up and said, wow, 6 kids. But this is Abraham in the desert at night, and it's going to be innumerable posterity. And based on that promise, that first P of the Abrahamic covenant, the 2 other P's will follow, a promised land for that posterity, and priesthood, and all the blessings that come with it for that posterity. Now, if you're going to have innumerable seed, you have to start somewhere, namely with at least one child. And that's the sticking point for Abraham and Sarah, because they can't have posterity. Now, this part of the story we all know, but I want to introduce you to a part that we don't seem to understand quite as well. And it's in chapter 15. You see, by now, Abraham has already rescued his nephew Lot, putting himself in danger to be able to care for family. I mean, he's going to be father of the faithful for good reason. And then he receives this blessing from the Lord at the beginning of chapter 15. God appears to him in a vision and says, "Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward." In other words, I protected you. There's the shield part. I will bless you. There's the great reward part. But Abraham pushes back gently and says, "Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless?" In other words, what great reward could possibly take the place of the child of promise that you promised me? It's interesting that in chapter 15, Abraham will think outside the box. And then in chapter 16, Sarah will think outside the box. And I think what's motivating them is, I don't see how on earth you can keep your promises within this box. So here's some other options. Do we sometimes do that? Here's some other ways that you could still bless me, God, without actually doing what you said that you would do. Well, that's not enough trust on our part. And you see Abraham wrestling with that himself, because at the end of 15:2, he says, well, how are you going to bless me? Is it going to be through my steward, Eliezer of Damascus? Is he going to be kind of adopted into the family, and that's how we're going to bless the world? Well, the Lord probably appreciates Abraham helping him out. But Abraham, I don't need that help. I've got this. And so he says, no, Abraham, it's not going to be your servant. It's going to be your son. And it will come through your own seed, your own flesh and blood. And then he proves the point to him. You see, there's an amazing phrase in verse 6. And he believed in the Lord. Notice that promise there. He believed in the Lord. He didn't just believe in the outcome. He trusted the relationship that he had. I believe in the Lord, and whatever he's going to do is good by me. Well, he goes through this ritual that's fascinating in chapter 15. It's confusing until we understand a little bit of what is going on here. Abraham is told to take a bunch of animals, a cow and a goat and a ram and some birds, and to cut them in half, and then to lay out the pieces of the carcasses kind of across from each other, which sounds really strange until you understand that in Hebrew, the verb they use for making a covenant is to cut. We talk about cutting a deal. Well, they would cut a covenant. And so you're taking these sacrificial animals, you're cutting them, and then laying them out opposite one another as if you were laying out the limits of a straight and narrow path. Can you picture this? I mean, Abraham is taking this seriously. Later that evening, these vultures come down to kind of pick at the carcasses, and he shoos them all away. Like, no, get away from my visual aid. And then that night, a cloud of smoke and a pillar of fire, which we usually recognize from the Exodus story. This represents the presence of God. It comes down and then passes between the parts of those sacrificial animals. It's as if the Lord is coming and saying, Abraham, if you really believe me, then trust me and follow me, because I am passing down this straight and narrow path and staying within the confines of covenant. I promise, Abraham, you don't have to look outside the box. You don't have to look outside the covenant for the blessings that I've promised you. They're just further ahead than you imagined. I'm so amazed by people that I know that resist the temptation of looking outside the confines of covenant for what they're looking for. People that have endured being single for longer than they'd thought. But instead of looking outside the covenant, they look further down the path and they continue walking it, knowing that no blessing will be withheld them if they will continue faithful. Well, that's exactly what Abraham decides to do by the end of chapter 15. But now it's Sarah's turn. And in chapter 16, she gets a gut check of her own. Remember, Abraham was thinking, well, maybe it's not going to be through my body, and I'll just adopt this servant of mine. Well, now it's Sarah's turn because she realizes God promised my husband that he would have literal posterity. So I wonder if I'm the weak link in the chain. Maybe I'm the reason that my husband can't have children, which means maybe I'm the reason that God can't keep his word. My heart goes out to Sarah in this moment. But as she starts thinking outside of her box, based on the culture of her time period, which allowed for plural marriage, she offered her handmaid Hagar to Abraham and said, this way God can keep his promise to you. And I will make this incredible self-sacrifice to allow for this to happen. I'm amazed that she rose to that level of divinity to be able to do it. You'll see if you take some time and study chapter 16 on your own, that eventually her divinity kind of comes back down to some humanity, which gives me hope for myself. Since there are days where I'm committed to do all that God asks of me, and I trust all of his promises, and then other days where, a little more natural man pops up. And you'll see some of that in chapter 16. But by chapter 17, again, the Lord reassuring Abram, thank you for thinking outside the box. You don't need to. Sarah, thank you for making a self-sacrifice and thinking outside your box. But it's within the confines of covenant that the blessings will come. And it's not just through Abraham, literally. It's through you, literally, too. And so in chapter 17, when their names are finally changed, Abraham is told, I will bless you a son, and it will be through Sarah. Because he keeps thinking, he keeps trying to make it easier on God and saying, no, Ishmael's good enough. I have a son through Hagar, and if you want to keep your promises, we can begin blessing the world along those lines. And God says, no, it's going to be through Sarah. And Abraham laughs. And God kind of calls him out on it. A few chapters later, Sarah will once again be reassured, you will have a child. And then she laughs and gets called out on it. I love this comic relief, though. Their son, Isaac, Yitzhak in Hebrew, actually means to laugh. It also means to rejoice. Can you picture the combination of those two words? No wonder there's such an overlap. But I love the thought of Isaac being their comic relief. Tragedies always end in heartbreak, but comedies always end in joy. And this incredible couple has had enough heartbreak in their life, as they have waited decades for this blessing to come. No wonder they both laugh/rejoice at the thought of that promise. When the blessing actually comes, and Sarah names him Isaac, she then says, I want the world to be able to laugh with me, to rejoice with me, because I know a God who keeps his promises. Now with that, we need to go back to our Faith Hall of Fame. And in Hebrews 11, there is a whole section dedicated to Abraham and Sarah, and they deserve it, believe me. Through faith also, Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed, and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Do you remember that phrase from Genesis 15? That Abraham believed in God, believed in the Lord. Here, she judges him faithful who had promised. Remember, this is relational faith, not propositional faith. I trust God. My belief is in him. Faith is the premise, not the conclusion. Then later in chapter 11, as we shift from Sarah to Abraham, we read this. By faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that received the promise offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. Now we're combining two stories here, because we have the incredible test of faith. Will I have a child of promise? And then the other gut check test of faith. Will I be able to hold on to this child of promise? The Lord is testing Abraham and Sarah and Isaac, this first family of faith, from every possible angle. And the way it's described here in Hebrews 11 is, again, pushing the limits on Abraham's trust in God. You said I'd have posterity. How will it come? It will come through you. Well, will it come through Sarah? Yes. Here comes Isaac. And then as the years pass and he grows, and God gives him the ultimate Abrahamic test, will you offer him? Will you give back to me what I gave to you? And what's hard about this is thinking, then how, we're back to square one then. How are you going to keep your word with me? If I slay this son, then there can be no posterity like the sands of the sea or the stars of heaven. And yet notice the next phrase. Accounting that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead. That blows me away. Abraham did not raise the knife thinking that the angel was about to come. He wasn't looking for some escape route. He fully intended to sacrifice this child of promise. And then how is God going to keep his promise? Through him? Somehow by raising him up even from the dead. Now that blows me away. Faith not just to sacrifice his son, but faith to raise him again? Now, where does he even get this idea? By the time we're reading the book of Hebrews, we understand the symbolism of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the only begotten son, same phrase used to describe Isaac here. But then notice the end of verse 19. So we've read, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, then this, from whence also he received him in a figure. Now, that's a little cryptic. What does he mean by that? What gave Abraham the faith to know that somehow this son of mine can come back to life from the dead? Why? Well, I already received him that way in a figure. In other words, God has given me reassurance in advance that he can bring life from death because he's already done it. He brought life, my son, out of my body that was dead. He brought my son out of my wife's womb, which by age 90 was dead as well. We see that comparison earlier in the book of Romans. In Romans chapter 4, where Paul is describing similar things, he speaks of Abraham and Sarah and says, being not weak in faith, he considered not his own body, now dead, when he was about 100 years old, neither yet the deadness of Sarah's womb. You understand this now? By whence he brought him by a figure? What was the figure? This son always emerges from the grave. A dead body, a dead womb, parents far past the possibility of bringing life. So if it comes down to me having to sacrifice this son, the ultimate gut check, I know that God will raise life from death. He's done it before. The way Paul ends that thought in Romans takes us back to Hebrews 11, takes us back to Genesis 17. He staggered not at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strong in faith, giving glory to God, and being fully persuaded that what he had promised, he was able also to perform. Do you sense that relational faith? That trust without reservation? To put this entire story in perspective, Paul uses this phrase to describe this first family of faith, who against hope believed in hope. That to me is relational faith. That to me is hospital bed faith. That to me is mountain moving faith. It's against the odds. Against hope, you believe in hope. In the face of death, you believe in life. Against faith, you believe in faith because you know that God keeps his promises. If I could change one minor detail from Paul's incredible phrase, who against hope believed in hope, I would keep the first hope lowercase and I'd make the second hope capital. Because it's that difference between proximate hopes and the ultimate hope, which comes through the hope of the world. Against our doubts, against our concerns, against our fears, against those hopes that we aren't sure that they can be fulfilled, believe in hope. Believe in capital H hope. Believe in the hope of the world. No wonder that hope of the world called upon Abraham to give one last incredible object lesson. And this is one that ties together everything else we've talked about so far today. In between the miracle of Isaac's birth and the miracle of Isaac's preservation, in chapter 17 of Genesis, when all that laughing goes on, the comic relief knowing that this will have a happy ending, there's an interesting Joseph Smith translation addition to that talks about some apostasy that was taking place during Abraham's day. They were losing sight of certain ordinances and certain beliefs, and one of the things that made the biggest difference is that they lost sight of what the atonement really would all be about. Because there was some kind of belief, according to this Joseph Smith translation edition, that they thought that salvation came through the blood of Abel, that the blood of the righteous Abel was shed for sins. That's how it's phrased. That actually solves a mystery from the book of Hebrews, because later it talks about, oh no, the blood of Christ speaks of greater things than the blood of Abel. And people kind of scratch their head going, blood of Abel, where did that come from? Well, Joseph Smith helps us with that. But to me, what I see there is, here's God saying to Abraham, people have lost their faith in me because they don't understand what I am going to do for them to make all things possible. The only thing that rights every wrong is the atonement of Jesus Christ. The only way to bring life out of death, including what seem to be dead promises, is the atonement of Jesus Christ. And they're misunderstanding it. Somehow through these centuries, they've thought that Abel's blood would save them, would heal them. No, it's only the blood of my begotten Son. And so, Abraham, I need you to do something for me. I can't let people go away thinking that the atonement is some act of a brother rising up against a brother. This is not Satan crucifying Christ. This is a loving Father offering his only begotten Son. That's what the atonement is. And so, Abraham, will you be my visual aid? Will you show them what this self-sacrifice really is all about? Will you be me and let your son be my son? And once again, against hope, will you believe in hope so that others can have hope in the hope of the world? Isaiah builds upon this, as do writers of the Book of Mormon that quote this same passage. Isaiah said, "Hearken to me, ye that follow after righteousness. Ye that seek the Lord, look unto the rock whence ye are hewn, and to the hole of the pit whence ye are digged." And then he gets more specific. "Look unto Abraham your father, and unto Sarah that bare you." That is the rock that we're cut out of. Abraham and Sarah are the father and mother of the faith because they exemplify it. In fact, one last thought, especially for you sisters. We always speak of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Beautiful title for Christ, him in whom we place our faith. But as we learned today, it wasn't going to come just through Abraham, or Ishmael would have sufficed. Isaac had to come through Sarah. Jacob had to come through Rebekah. Joseph had to come through Rachel. If you were to trace the line of covenant, if you were to follow the path of promise, mothers, in many ways, factored in more importantly than even the fathers did, because there were other options through other mothers. But who did God choose? More than he being the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he is the God of Sarah and Rebekah and Rachel. That is the rock that we are hewn from, and those are the examples to whom we can look for saving faith, for relational faith. So look to them, and by looking to them, look to him. Trust them, and in trusting them, trust in him. Whatever you're up against, whenever you are against hope, believe in hope, the hope of the world.